his belief in God is a science starter. There is this underlying unity to his thought. What brings all of those strands together for Newton? It's his belief in God. It's his theism, because his monotheism is this unifying framework for Newton. Everything that he studies within the context of his belief in one God who created everything, who is sovereign over history, who inspired the Bible, who revealed himself in nature.
Sir Isaac Newton was arguably the greatest scientist of all time. He independently developed calculus, discovered new properties of light, and precisely formulated the law of universal gravitation. Yet his most important scientific works were infused with natural theology, the idea that nature itself revealed the mind of a creator God at work. Far from being a secularist that gave us a clockwork universe in which God played no role, he saw God as immanent in creation, upholding, sustaining, and interacting with it every moment.
Written in historical records, documented in Tacitus and Josephus. For those who don't believe us, check the marks of architecture written on a fetus. Neural nets and error correcting codes complete us.
Chaos theory.
My name is Stephen Snobelen, and I teach history of science and technology at the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I teach a full range of the history of science from the ancient world right up to the 21st century, including artificial intelligence and a lot of the latest technology. But my main focus is the relationship between science and religion. And that's across history from antiquity to the modern period. But again, with a particular focus on the early modern period, and thinking in terms of concentric rings, the subset of that would be Isaac Newton, looking at the ways in which, for Newton, science and religion related, but also when we look at his output, his manuscripts, how we see the relationship between science and religion, between his faith in God and the way he operated in his natural philosophy, which is the earlier version of what we now call science. I think it's fair to say that Newton was a polymath, right? There's this expression, polymath, someone who is almost like a Renaissance man. In fact, with some accuracy, we can call Newton a Renaissance man in two senses. So he's a Renaissance man sort of in that historical sense because he's at the end of that time period, but he's a Renaissance man in the common way we use that term today, in that he's a polymath. He is doing various things. So let me just rehearse some of his intellectual endeavors. He's most famous for his mathematics, his optics, and his physics. So the mathematics includes most famously his calculus. And he's developing that when he's still a fairly young man, when he's in his 20s. Also, when he's in his 20s, he's doing his early experiments with the prism, where he discovers that light has this really interesting quality where sunlight is not pure, which intuitively we would think it would be, but that it's actually all light, right? He's able to show this with his prism experiments, including the crucial experiment. So that's all in his 20s. He publishes his paper on colors in 1672. Many people think it's the first true scientific paper. It has some diagrams in it and a brief sketch of his experiment. His great work is the Principia Mathematica. First edition comes out in 1687. Then in 1704, he publishes his Optics, so his full book on his optical theory. And both of his works, both of his books, the Principia and the Optics, are not just important for their content and the sciences that they articulate, but they're also important as exemplars of the scientific method. And Newton outlines some aspects of his scientific method in his rules of reasoning that are developed over the three editions of the Principia. But we also see it at work in the Optics. In his General Scholium, which he adds to the second 1713 edition of his Principia Mathematica, what he says is that it is perfectly appropriate to bring in natural theology when you're working in natural philosophy. And that includes his astronomical physics, his mathematical physics that you see throughout the Principia. And so the idea here is that you can derive basic principles of theology inductively from observing the heavens or the natural world. And he says that when you look at the frame of nature, to use his language, you see evidence of design. You see evidence of a very powerful, in fact, an infinite mind behind it. Now, what I haven't mentioned yet are his humanities endeavors. And those are also extremely significant. It's just that they're not as well known. So, for example, he was a historian. He studied ancient chronology, and he was working, his last work was his Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. He was working on that literally in his final days, and that came out in 1728 after his death. And one of the things he does, which is quite innovative, is he uses astronomy to help date historical events. So that's a very interesting example of the way that his sciences come together with his humanities. And then he studies church history. He writes long treatises on the history of the church. He is a prophetic exegete. He studies biblical prophecy. He studies the book of Daniel. He studies the book of Revelation, aka the Apocalypse. He's very fascinated by the symbols of the book of Revelation. And one of the things that unifies Newton's thought is that he is very adept at pattern recognition, right? You see this in his explication of the laws of nature, but also in looking at the prophetic symbols. He studied ancient science. He studied doctrine. He studied ancient religion. So yeah, he's doing all of those things. So he was very much a full-time scholar, and he'd work at the Mint in the daytime. He'd come home and he'd work on biblical prophecy or church history or chronology, right? And so I think he is one of the best examples of the Renaissance man in the polymath sense. One final point I'll make about all of that is that although he does recognize and respect disciplinary distinctions, there's certainly cross-fertilization between all of those areas. And I think there's an interesting lesson in that, because I think that helps explain his tremendous creativity, is that although he does want to recognize the disciplinary distinctions of the academic world, he benefits from a little bit of bleed-through here and there, where his inductive method can be used not only in his sciences, but also in interpreting biblical prophecy. So he has a kind of a holistic attitude to method, and also there is this underlying unity to his thought. What brings all of those strands together for Newton? It's his belief in God. It's his theism, because his monotheism is this unifying framework for Newton. Everything that he studies within the context of his beliefs in one God who created everything, who is sovereign over history, who inspired the Bible, who revealed himself in nature. So there is this fundamental unity to his thought that I think if more people recognize that, they would have a much better understanding of the true Newton, rather than the sort of distorted view that we get in modern culture, that he's sort of a proto-secular scientist.
Theos theory.